Hello, class. For this lecture block, I will be talking about and introducing you to the scientific method. So a little bit of review for this week. We will be reviewing what physical geography is throughout the lecture. We will be identifying the scientific method. At this point in time, you should finalize reading chapter 1 in your textbook. Make sure you're making note of any key terms or questions that you may have. This week, you also will have a weekly discussion involving a video presentation by Andrea Wolf. And you will also have a scientific method worksheet where the answers will be due by the following Monday. This week, I'm also providing a separate audio clip of just the audio portion of this lecture for those that are commuting and would like to listen to the lecture in the car, as well as audio and visuals as you saw hosted through YouTube. So at this point in time, you should be familiar with the definition of geography. We went ahead and defined geography. We identified that the words that make up geography, geo, the earth, and graphein, to write, basically meaning to write about the earth. And we also identified the book definition of geography, and that it's a science that studies the relationship among the natural systems. And it focuses on geographic areas, it focuses on society, cultural activities, and the fact that everything's interdisciplinary and there's an independence of all of these over space. So we know that there is a spatial component to the discipline of geography. Now your textbook identifies how there's so much crossover. This is another figure to help emphasize the relationship between physical geography and human cultural geography. And there's this constant back and forth amongst the disciplines, one focusing on the physical and life sciences of the physical geography, while the other focuses on the human and cultural sciences. Again, there are a list of the disciplines that focus on physical geography and life sciences and human and cultural sciences. And as we talked about before, both sides can interact amongst each other in this holistic synthesis between the two. So from your standpoint, it's good to have an understanding about the fields that make up physical geography and the different fields that make up human and cultural sciences. We also talked about the 4 different spheres or parts of the textbook and topics that we will be talking about throughout the semester. So physical geography, from the standpoint of our textbook, is broken down into 4 parts. The first part is what we were talking about and we will be talking about for the next couple weeks, identifying the solar system in relationship to the Earth and seasons, the Earth's modern atmosphere, and atmosphere surface energy balances, and global temperatures and atmospheric circulation patterns, as well as oceanic patterns. And we define this sphere as the atmosphere. The second one, we're going to talk about the hydrosphere, and topics that will be included in this sphere is water and atmospheric moisture, weather, water resources, global climate systems as a whole. The third sphere that we'll talk about is planet Earth, which we call the lithosphere. And here we'll be talking about tectonic, earthquake, volcanism, weathering, karst landscape, mass movement, river systems and landforms, aeolian processes, arid landscapes, the oceans, coastal processes and landforms, and glacial. Lot to be covered here. And then the fourth sphere is the biosphere, the living systems. And here we'll be talking about biomes, the geography of soils, ecosystem, and terrestrial biomes. So this is what you have to look forward to throughout the semester. Now, we did identify that geography is a science, and we know that science disciplines uses the scientific method. And a little bit of review here. So when we say what is science, we know that science comes from the Latin word scien, to know, and the scientific method is a process that methodically and logically produces knowledge. The scientific method involves observation. It involves conditional explanation, so a hypothesis, and it involves testing and experimentation. And the elements that make up the scientific method is composed of the observation in question, verification, fact and evidence, deduction and induction reasoning, prediction, hypotheses, falsification, and opinion. Now, some of these steps may sound familiar, others may not, but know that all of these steps are part of the universal language which we define as the scientific method. So universal language, or another way to say it, the universal process, the universal method that all scientists use to undergo the scientific method. And the reason behind the strength of the scientific method is that it is universal. All scientists are following the protocol of what you do first, second, and third, allowing for science and the discovery to be repeatable and tested. Now we can look at the flow chart. This is from your textbook of the scientific method. And for this case, we want to go ahead and start at the bottom here. So we have our real world situation. We have our perception. So what do we know and understand? What do we want to know? What's our question that needs answering? So at this point, once we have some sort of observation, we have some sort of question, we can go ahead and go on to the next observation and measurements. So here we have data collection, acquisition, and observation that makes up the measurements and observation portion. So questions that we have here are, what data are needed? How do we collect this information? What's this collection methods? And do any of the revisions need to take place here regarding data collection or methods? So then we can go on to our next inductive reasoning. So this is our building useful models of our real systems that we have conceptualized. This is looking at the numerical outputs. This is allowing for explanation, analysis, and interpretation of that data collected. So then we go ahead and we move into our hypotheses. So hypotheses here is where we have a general statement which summarizes the data and observations and the model simulations that we have identified. So here we're searching for patterns and order, so a process that's put in place. From hypotheses, we move on to prediction. So this allows us to, our experiments conducted, we need to gather more data through observation and measurements for us to refine our hypotheses. We are at our predictions, we are allowed to experiment, test, and verify. So then we move into, once the process is completed, we can go through the general theory of governing laws. So meaning that, you know, a scientific idea is put through this scientific method over and over and over again. And at this point, when it is produced, the same results over and over again, we can have a general theory. So real world understood, the knowledge of how things happen and behave as a part of a broad general principle. And here we have a theory formulation that is born. So let's look at some of the elements and examples which will be very valuable for the activity that you will have later on today. So we have our observation and question. So a particular scenario would be, driving around town, I noticed that while pine trees grow on taller western mountains, i.e. Mount Rose, they are largely absent from Peavine Mountain north of town. I wonder why this is. So notice that there is an observation and some sort of question that's a part of that observation. Okay, so here's an example of verification. I think I'll hike Peavine and make sure there are no pine trees. Okay, an example of fact evidence. There are pine trees up here on Peavine by the way they are all towards the top. Okay, so the scientists went up to Peavine, verified it, and showed that there was a fact and evidence that there are pine trees on Peavine, however, they're towards the top. So an opinion would be something, for example, wood from oak make better furniture than wood from pines. Okay, so now we have an example of our induction and deduction inference. So from what I've seen, it appears that pine trees grow where there are more water from the winter's snow, and there are more and is typical more snow. There's typically more snow at the top, and the words are kind of cut off there, so sorry about that. There's more snow at the higher elevation. So then we get into our deductive and inductive reasoning. So induction is a reasoning from a part of a whole, from individual or universal standpoint. Deduction is an inference of evidence, which is based upon a conclusion. So we mainly deal with deduction in science, but induction also does have a place there as well. So then we can go ahead and get into prediction. I predict that I will find pine trees growing at the top of the mountain ranges throughout Nevada. Okay. We can also hypothesize, and I suggest that in arid regions such as Nevada, pine tree growth will be limited to upper elevation sites, which receive significant sufficient snowpack in the winter. Okay, so then we also have falsification. Hang on. I live in Galena and I notice pine trees on the way home are at relatively low elevations. Plus, what about all those pine trees along the Truckee River as I head towards Truckee? I need more observations. Okay, so as you see, these are all examples of the different components that make up the scientific method that allows for a theory to be tested and born over time. So in the scientific method activity, you will be pairing the vocab words of observation, verification, fact, and evidence to different scenarios. So you're going to try to find the right match for these key terms and the different summaries. Now, when we talk about geography, since we know that geography is a spatial science, we need to deal with location. So questions that we're constantly asking ourselves are where we are and where something is. So typically, geography can also be defined as the why of where. Why is something located where it's at, and what's the pattern that we're seeing? So in order for us to have a location, we need a means to location to point to an area on the Earth's surface. In that case, we need some way to measure and provide an address of that location.